Next to me, I have the new Mission 700 speakers, the second of this type of new old design of speakers from Mission. Or maybe you could call them the little brothers to the recently released 770 speakers that you can also see there behind me. And I have the very first production pair of 770 speakers, serial number 0001. And I like them that much that I bought the review pair. But I also know that they will be too expensive still for some audiophiles, regardless of their quality. And that is where I have some great news, because the new Mission 700 speakers cost about a third, and they are still quite close in terms of their outright performance. And yeah, I think in some ways I might even prefer them. I think it's important to explain the scenario here for maybe those who are new to this range of Mission speakers, because yes, there is a real trend for speaker manufacturers to make speakers that have a vintage type of look and maybe even a vintage type of sound. We all know this, but I actually think there is a little more going on here with this range of speakers from Mission, because the speakers designer, Peter Como, obviously I've met with him and made a video with him, which I'll link up there for you. He has a real passion for the original 700, I'm going to call them, range of speakers from back in the 1970s and the 1980s. And he has designed this new range to mimic what was special to him about those originals in terms of sound quality. But these are not the same speakers. These are completely re-engineered speakers from the ground up to be very modern in terms of their outright performance, but maybe with some characters, some of the character of the speakers from the 1970s and 1980s. And you know what? I think it really works, because this is the second pair of these speakers that I've spent literally 5 minutes setting them up. Just sat them down on the stands. Obviously, I have the spot marks in the room, but I literally just sat them down on the stands, pressed play, and hours later, I'm still sat there listening to music, because they are just very engaging and enjoyable speakers to listen to. I have spent so much time with the Mission 770, I have a very strong point of reference for comparison to the new 700. And I'm actually going to start this review there with a totally unfair comparison of the Mission 770 to the new Mission 700. The reason it's an unfair comparison is the price. The 770s with stands cost £3,500, whereas the new 700 with stands only cost £1,499. So there is a £2,001 price difference. So that means you could have two sets of 700 speakers, maybe one in different rooms of your home, and still have a considerable chunk of change left over. So again, a huge price difference actually between these speakers, and you could save some further money still. If you bought the speakers individually without the stands, you would save a few £100s, but I really do think you would want the stands as well, because obviously they're designed to work with the speakers, but they're also just really nice, particularly the 700 stands. They are really very nice. And when you put the 700 and 770s side by side with the grills on, besides the obvious colour and size difference, it's hard to see much difference beyond that. And I actually think these could be any number of different speakers, but remove the grills and the differences and similarities do become obvious. And of course, these are very obviously Missions. I know that white front baffle will divide opinion, but I really like it. And I actually really like the black finish of the speakers and the black and white look much more than I thought I would, even though it's very matchy-matchy with my room's acoustic treatment design. And the 700 is obviously different for having the tweeter below the mid-bass driver in what's called an inverted driver geometry. And this is something Mission have been doing since the early days. And it's intended to improve the speaker's acoustic centre, so the treble and mid-range reach the ear better time aligned, so the speakers image better. And I definitely noticed very good soundstage imaging, especially out to the sides or beyond the speakers playing, but also just a very good, well-imaged soundstage in general. The mid-bass driver is 165mm or 6.5-inch polypropylene based, but with minerals used too to make the driver stiffer and perform better. The tweeter is a 28mm or 1 and a bit inch microfiber soft dome with a rear chamber, and I think it looks cool. The cabinet is made from a sandwich of MDF and fiberboard to create this kind of inert structure. A pretty dead one, and for comparison, the 770's cabinet sounds like this. So the 770 is definitely more inert, and you can feel it as you wrap your knuckles against the cabinets. And the 700 is still pretty good and inert, just not as good and not as inert. And you can see the 700 are front ported, and some other important specs to know: they have an 8 ohm impedance, dropping to 5.2 ohms. They have an 86 dB sensitivity, so they are a little harder to drive than the 770, but still not too taxing a load for the amplifier. And the crossover has been designed from a combination of computer modelling and simulation, and then many hundreds of hours of listening, and it's separated into 2 boards, one for the mid-bass driver and one for the high-frequency driver. And this all sounds very, very similar to the 770 speakers, because we get a lot of what is in the 770 speakers, I suppose, in terms of outright design. All of that is still in the 700 speakers, but they're definitely not the same speakers, definitely not the same. And one more quick point on the stands. I think they are great stands that look really nice, and I prefer how the 700 stands look compared to the 770, partly because of the finish. I prefer it, but I also just like having the Mission logo on the stands. But one thing I noticed was this. So as you can hear, the 700 stands clearly have a lot more audible ringing compared to the 770 stands, and I don't know why that is. Both of them are intended to have kind of like an anti-resonance system built in. So I actually still like the 700 stands. I really like the height of them. I really like the look of them. The height they seem to put speakers at seems to work really nicely for me in this room in terms of bass. So yeah, I think I might have to keep these 700 stands, then have a little play around with some maybe different filler materials to see if I can't, improve their performance even more. For me, stuff like that is just fun to do. So let's talk sound quality. Before I jump into a comparison between the 700s and 770s, I want to talk to you about my early impressions of listening to the 700s with what I think is a great system synergy. My initial listening to the 700 was about a week solid with the Audiolab Omnia as part of the review of the Omnia, and I will link its review up there for you. And I was told there is a great synergy between the Omnia and the 700 speakers, and this was totally true. And my latter testing was with a totally different system, and it didn't work as well in ways, despite costing a lot more money. And this is how the 700s measured in my room. And this will help me explain their overall sound quality above where the room takes over the measurements. You can see a fairly well behaved speaker here from above 100 Hz, which is very impressive, but there are some distinct character points that stand out. Firstly is the very smooth but quite early rolled off treble, and this is something that you definitely hear, but with the right system you likely won't mind at all, because it means the speakers sound smooth and music quality forgiving. It does mean the treble is clean and clear sounding with nice detail, but it's softer delivered with less shimmer and attack than some other speakers, even the 770 for example. So system synergy becomes important, and the Audiolab Omnia, with its very obvious high frequency ambience to its presentation, balances really very nicely. At the other end of the spectrum, it's difficult to see from the graphs because of the effect of the room. The bass from the 700 is very impressive in terms of output and extension, and there is plenty of drive there for the electronic music I listen to, but also some really nice deep and tight bass notes in the song Life Goes On by Carla Bley. Bass you feel in your bum and your feet, that deep. Now there seems to be a little bit of bloom on the bass, I think more in the upper bass, which adds some fullness and boldness to the sound, which I am totally fine with, and I actually like that type of presentation when it's done well. But it does fill the soundstage space some and makes it feel less open, less look through the speakers onto the music. Instead, it's a warmer, more lush, maybe more vintage type of sound. And this is different to the 770 speakers, where they are more open sounding, as they are more neutral in their upper bass. I think the more bloomed and full upper bass of the 700 will help lesser quality or leaner sounding amplifiers sound more pleasing. And again, the open, airy, lighter touch sound of the Omnia works really nice here as it balances. Now, interestingly, and not something that I picked up initially, it seems like there is a little bit of push in the upper vocals, and I think that is likely designed in to help the 700 sound more on the front foot for vocals and not too set back and too soft. So there is still energy and liveliness to vocals delivery, and I think this is really important for the overall balancing act, balancing the sound with that slightly bloomed, warmer upper bass and lower vocal. And I think it works. I think it works really nicely because it means there is still some liveliness and energy to music and liveliness and energy to vocals combined with a more relaxed and overall smooth type of presentation, a nice balancing act of both, which means music is smooth and easy to listen to and relaxing, but it's also not boring because there is a bit of liveliness and energy to it. Now, on the odd occasion with some particular music, maybe there could be a little bit of overexcitement or maybe a little bit of shoutiness to some vocals, or maybe in completely different music, maybe there's just a little bit of what might be called woodiness or chestiness with some vocals, but it's only when it's in the music anyway. So I think it comes across as quite a natural way to present that music rather than, an always over-exaggerated way to present all music. And there is a big distinguishing, defining difference there. And for me, I find this type of speaker and sound presentation very enjoyable and very engaging. But I can see others maybe not finding it gritty or, high frequency attacking enough. Maybe for others it won't be kind of outright bang neutral enough. Maybe for others it might not be as open enough or, not as open as they look for. Or maybe for some it might not be warm enough. Maybe some audiophiles want it to be even warmer than this. But I would say it's kind of somewhere sitting nicely in the middle of all of those things. But definitely with more of a focus on a bit more warmth and a bit more of a warmer, bolder, more pleasing overall character. And for me, the big difference between the 700 and 770 is the 770 is more transparent to the music, but also to the hi-fi system quality. And I think the 770 will sound larger and can sound larger and grander, as you would expect, as they are larger with a larger mid-bass driver. But I also think they get out of the way of the music more and show you a clearer window into the music with a more obviously three-dimensional soundstage. But as always, it will depend on the quality of the hi-fi system you put before them, the way you set them up in the room itself, all the usual factors. Whereas I think with the 700 speakers, audiophile will probably find it easier to get to a very good, pleasing result. I think they will be less fussy, or less critical of your setup and less critical of the hi-fi system. That is a very distinguishing, important difference, I think, to pay attention to. And I think the fact that they are a bit smaller. Maybe it's the fact that they're smaller, or maybe it's the inverted driver geometry. In here, I only have a small listening room, but I did notice they were really very good at resolving the soundstage sounds outside of the speakers. And I actually think they did that with a bit more obvious clarity than the sound I get from the 770s. Now, the 770s produce a bigger sound, so the images of the soundstage are all bigger, and the images that are created outside of the speakers are larger. But I'm just not sure if maybe it's quite as crisp, the way they resolve them is quite as crisp in this small listening room as the 700s do. So yeah, that could be one area where the 700s, even though they cost a third, in this small listening room they have the advantage. If if I had to define the sound quality of the new Mission 700s, I would actually put it somewhere in between Wharfedale's Evo speakers and maybe Wharfedale's Linton speakers, somewhere in between those, which is actually not a bad place to be when you think about it. And some of you might remember back to my Evo 4.2 review where I used the raisin diagram to try and describe the differences between the Lintons and the Evos. And I don't have Lintons here, but I do have Wharfedale's Evo 4.2 here. So I did some comparative listening as I thought it could be useful to know if the Mission 700s would be a good potential upgrade. And I also bumped up the system quality quite a lot, incorporating the new NAD M23 power amplifier using the M10 V2 as the source and preamplifier. And my first impressions of the Evo 4.2 in this system was, no wonder I like these speakers and bought them. If you own these speakers, you can be happy because they are great. I can't fault them for their £599 price tag. Wharfedale really nailed it with these speakers. And they sound pretty huge in this room, with a great contrast to their soundstage being sometimes deeper, look onto the music, and other times more out to you as the listener. And the vocals are a little bloomier and less focused than the Missions, and there is definitely less composure to their presentation. Vocals and everything really just sounds less secure. It's more edgy, or with more edginess. And the overall sound is definitely a little heavier and more shouting at you at louder volumes. But I am really nitpicking here considering their price point. And the Evo 4.2 are just cracking speakers for the money. Their 3D soundstage is stunning, and they present a quite live sounding vocal in ways with the right music. I just think they're great. But switching back to the Mission 700, straight away the quality of the sound improves. Its refinement goes up several levels, as does its solidity, and what I call tactility, your ability to reach out and touch the sound. And you do straight away hear the bolder, stronger, richer sound of the Missions, but there is some loss of soundstage openness, but you do feel much closer to the music. The overall sound also feels grander too, because it's so much more sure-footed and solid, and the vocals are a little softer, but they are more soulful when that's the intention, and definitely more focused. But there is still a slight bloom to them, a little bit like how a vintage camera lens shines a nice gloss on your image. So would the Mission 700 speakers be an obvious upgrade if you have Wharfedale Evo 4.2? Well, definitely yes, and maybe no. They are definitely better speakers in terms of creating a bigger, more tangible, richer, bolder, stronger, and I think a better, probably nicer overall music listen. But it is going to be a different type of music listen, not totally wildly different, but different enough. And I think in that situation, it would always make sense to have a listen just to make sure that, the way the Missions present music is what you like. But, in saying that, I think if anybody upgraded from the Evo 4.2 to the new Mission 700, you're definitely not going to be disappointed that you did. Then to compare to a speaker a little more price appropriate, I also have here the JBL HDI 1600, and these do cost a few £100 more, but they are definitely in the same price category. And my first surprise was just how much larger the Missions are compared to the JBL, significantly larger actually. And obviously their designs couldn't be any more different in terms of the technicals and the visual approach. And the JBLs were not on ideal height stands, but taking that into account, they just sound smaller than the Missions. Their overall sound is more focused and clear cut, but definitely smaller in terms of scale. I found myself turning the volume up more to try and match the overall scale of sound from the Missions. The JBL do present excellent musical inner details, and their musical decays are also impressive, and they are also a very smooth sounding speaker, and their soundstage openness and sense of space reminds me more of the Evo 4.2. The JBL is also bold in their bass delivery, but I think in a different range to the Missions, maybe more in the 50Hz range, where I think the Missions are bolder a bit higher up. But their bass is not as well composed as with the Missions. Listening to Lady Blackbird, it will never happen again. But the vocals are crisper and have less bloom on them, so they are more focused and sat in a little more soundstage space, which I think is more of a modern hi-fi sound. And I think this works great for a song like Birds by Dominic Fils-Aimé, but less great with other music. So there are bits that I really like about the JBLs, and I think on my first A-B comparison session, I actually thought that they might have the edge, but several A-B comparison sessions later, I realised, they don't quite have the scale of the Mission, so I was turning them up more. Obviously, they don't have that same kind of character of sound that the Missions do, and that does something to you, or it does something to me. Maybe it won't to you, for for obvious reasons. But you know what? Both of these are really good speakers, and I don't see as you can really lose here. You can only really win if you're choosing either of these speakers, but you would definitely just win in different ways. But I would put the outright win between the two to the Missions, purely because they cost less, and I just prefer the look of them. I think they look nicer in this listening room. And before we finish this comparison section, I just want to say kudos to the NAD M23 power amplifier for pushing these speakers to limits I didn't know any of them had. Control, power, and more control. So time to wrap things up. I do think the Mission 700s is going to be a big hit with a lot of audiophiles because of what you are getting here for the money, and I think because of how close they get to the much more expensive 770 speakers. But this is something to consider. This has got to be one of the most difficult price points for any manufacturer to include a speaker, because there is such stiff competition and so many other speakers offering so many different things, such as the ultra high resolution KEF LS50 Meta, or maybe the really bold, bassy and energetic, lively sounding Dynaudio Evoke 20, or maybe the really musical sounding Sonos Faber Sonetto 2, or maybe the really great sounding vocals from the Acoustic Energy AE500, and the list goes on of really great speakers at this price category, and I've looked at loads of them in the past. But I think even with all of that crazy stiff competition, a speaker like the Mission 700 is going to stand out, and it's going to have a real distinct appeal to a lot of different audiophiles, probably because it puts itself kind of somewhere in the middle of all those different speakers, offering a lot of what those other speakers offer, plus some of its own distinct, unique character. The way these speakers present music, you just have to listen to it to appreciate. You have to listen to it to appreciate it. Sorry, it's just so engaging. It's so easy listen, but also easy listen, but with quality. And that quality is what makes the difference, because it stops them getting boring. But it's the easy listen, the engaging factor, that makes you want to listen to more music. And I really think Peter Como, the speakers designer, has done an excellent job. I think he's put these 700s right on the limit for their bass output and bass capability from the cabinet design, so you can really push them really hard for bass, and you don't hear the port, you don't hear the cabinet. And that's something that's really important to me, because if they didn't deliver the bass, they would not be for me, they would not impress me. But sitting on top of that bass, I think he's built in this lovely, really lovely speaker character of that, like I mentioned, engaging, relaxed, easygoing, but still quite lively and energetic sounding for vocals, so the speakers don't get boring, they don't not engage you because of that. And maybe the treble is a little soft, it's definitely a little soft for me personally, but that wouldn't stop me, and it definitely didn't stop me sitting and listening for hours, many hours actually, across a few weeks. And I've really enjoyed listening to these speakers. And bear in mind, the whole time they've been here, I'm sitting listening to them. I've got their bigger brothers, the 770s, here as well, and not once I've really had the desire to want to change the 700s out for the 770s or any of the other speakers that I've had here. And that really says a lot to me. Not that I'm saying that the 700s are outright better speakers, of course, that's not what I'm saying, but the 700s have been good enough to hold my attention, to keep me engaged, and to keep me sitting in that listening chair for hours and hours and hours. And that really says a lot to me about, I suppose, how much I've enjoyed listening to them. So I hope you've enjoyed this review. I hope you've found it useful and helpful. And if you'd like to see more reviews of this kind, please hit the subscribe button. And if you've enjoyed the video, maybe hit the like button while you're at it. Thanks very much for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.